Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Naruto was entrusted with a legendary gift. When Naruto is given a gift considered legendary even in a world where walking on water is a daily occurrence for some, will it lead him on a path towards peace, or will the consequences of said gift leave a hole in his heart too large to fill? Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel, and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard. Chapter 45, Flames v. The next week was an interesting one for Naruto. Between spending time helping the people of Wave with their problems and medical concerns and relaxing at the temple, he and Fu spent a lot of time at Tazuna's house. Naruto finally got the opportunity to meet the elusive bridge builder, and had a long and thorough conversation with the man about the example he was setting to Inari. It was enough to say that the number of sake bottles randomly strewn about the house had significantly decreased. Fu would continue to spend time with Inari, sometimes playing, sometimes training. Tsunami seemed disapproving at first, those thoughts about Inari becoming a shinobi and killing people running through her mind. However, seeing her son's smiling face as Fu praised him on finally learning a specific movement in her kata put her concerns somewhat at ease. She hadn't seen him this happy since Kaiser came into their lives. She only hoped that these new people that had returned their hope to them weren't taken away in a similar manner. It was the second day since the team from Konoha had arrived and Naruto was happily observing a game of shogi between Tazuna and Fu. He had never actually learned how to play the game himself, but was slowly picking it up from watching the two plays. After all, there were better ways of increasing one's patience in the temple without resorting to a game that was essentially war strategizing. It was actually rather remarkable what he could learn about somebody from just watching how they played the game. Fu was incredibly analytical, taking all the time she needed for each move as her eyes carefully roamed the board, planning out many moves ahead for a number of scenarios. Tazuna on the other hand seemed to be moving his pieces at seemingly random, only taking a few seconds to make his move. Yet there was something else in his eyes, a certain glint of challenge as he watched Fu frown over his latest move, her logical mind trying to puzzle out what kind of strategy the older man was employing when none could be seen. Check. Fu's mouth twisted into a slight smirk as she moved one of her pieces, squarely cornering Tazuna's king. Tazuna only seemed worried for a moment before a smirk of his own crossed his bearded features. Nice move, girlie, almost a shame I have to do this. Fu immediately frowned as Tazuna moved a piece of his own, cutting off Fu's attack on his king and simultaneously putting her back on the defensive, at least if she wanted to keep any semblance of control over the board. But how? Her eyes narrowed as she studied the entire board again, wondering just how Tazuna had managed to pull that off without her noticing. Tazuna just chuckled with mirth as he played with one of Fu's captured pieces idly. For a shinobi you're very rigid, aren't you? Fu just continued to search the board before scowling suddenly. You cheated. It wasn't so much a question as a statement, but Tazuna shrugged in answer all the same, still flicking the pawn between his fingers. Prove it. Just like that, the game was back on in full heat, this time with Fu not only scrutinizing his board, but Tazuna as well. Naruto had to stifle a chuckle at the bridge builder's ploy. The man hadn't cheated at all, at last as far as Naruto could tell. He simply misguided her into believing that she had absolute control of the game, while he moved randomly when in fact, he was slowly setting up this entire scenario from the beginning. It could never be said that experience didn't count for anything, and Tazuna had experience in the bucket loads. Pretty clever trick, huh? Naruto looked up from the tea he had slowly been sipping from, courtesy of Tsunami, to see Kakashi standing next to him, his eyes lazily following the game in front of them. Don't worry, Hataki-san, Fu will work out what he is doing eventually. She's very shrewd when it comes to these things. Kakashi just nodded slowly before offering a lethargic shrug, sitting down cross-legged next to the young blonde. I guess that's to be expected from a shinobi, even one from Takigakure. Externally, Naruto seemed completely unfazed, just casually sipping from his tea. However, inside was another story. He was around a second away from simply blasting this jounin into the ground should he so much as hint at Fu being a missing nin. The masked man turned to gauge his reaction for a moment before chuckling lightly, leaning back on his hands in a carefree manner. Not even a blink, you really are a monk, aren't you? Naruto languidly finished his sip before calmly placing the cup down, turning to the jounin expectantly. I assume you worked this out with your Sharingan eye? Kakashi gave him a mock pout, or the closest approximation to one with only one eye and his mouth covered. Mao, now the surprise is ruined, although as I understand it you were the one to check me over after my cute little Jin and brought me back to the house, so I shouldn't be too surprised. I just hope you didn't take a peek under the mask. His eye crinkled up into an upwards crescent that translated to a smile, or I might have to kill you. Naruto just remained impassive, the only sign he had even heard was the slight raising of one eyebrow. Kakashi simply pouted again, not really giving off the image of a supposedly powerful elite jounin. You're no fun, it's like talking to Asuma after he came back from his time with the 12 guardian shinobi. Naruto took another slow sip as he calmly observed the man before him. I assume you are referring to Asuma Sarutobi? Kakashi nodded once, which Naruto returned in kind. My senpai was good friends with him, a very strong and capable shinobi if his stories are anything to go by. Kakashi could only nod again. Asuma was a good friend of his after all. But no, for your information, my Sharingan had nothing to do with it. After all, her skin color is very rare outside of Tani no Kuni, and from the way she holds her kunai I can tell she is used to ones with slightly longer reach, and is having to adjust for that, just like the pronged ones they use in Taki. Naruto actually looked impressed by that. It was amazing that the man could work out so much from so very little. Curious girl, makes me wonder what she's doing out wandering with a monk from the fire temple, especially since she isn't wearing a headband. Naruto's hand tensed slightly, but before he could even think of doing anything, Kakashi suddenly leaned back, stretching out his back with a comfortable sigh. Now, while I don't read the bingo books religiously, I think I would have remembered seeing her in there somewhere. Kind of hard to miss the dark skin and mint green hair. Naruto sighed internally out of relief. Of course, Taki wouldn't put her in the bingo book. They couldn't let people know they had lost their Jinchuriki. It would make them seem vulnerable. Although I guess that begs the question of why you're out here, Naruto? You're a bit far from the temple, aren't you? Naruto found it strange to hear his name from this person, spoken as casually as if they had known one another for years. It was disconcerting. This is part of my pilgrimage. Kakashi nodded absently, not appearing to have even heard him at all. Naruto, unusual name that, isn't it? The blonde shrugged, sipping at his tea again. He needed to get his nerves under control before this man managed to pry something out of him. He knew exactly what would happen if they were to discover who he was, and he had no intention of returning to the village to become a shinobi. He had seen it for himself with Karabi. He would be on lockdown, never able to leave the village save to defend it, or on highly guarded missions. Missions where he'd be at high risk for dying, and the ones in charge knew it, but felt better a Jinchuriki die than anyone else. I wouldn't know, as I'm an orphan. I imagine my parents must have loved ramen a great deal to have my name based on it. Kakashi chuckled at that as he leaned forward, checking on the progress of the game only to find Fu and Tazuna in a stalemate. You know, I knew another Naruto once, around your age too. In fact, he had your blonde hair as well, although it was a lot shorter back then. Naruto simply raised an eyebrow from behind his tea as Kakashi looked away at the house. Of course, he was a loud-mouthed little kid who couldn't help but prank everything in sight. Also, his eyes were blue while yours are. He turned slowly, looking at Naruto expectantly, while the blonde simply looked back, a lilting smile on his face as he sipped his tea. You know, Hataki-san, it almost sounds as though I'm being interrogated. The silver-haired jounin simply gave him a patented eye smile as he waved the boy off. Mao, I'm just trying to get to know you is all. Naruto simply smiled peacefully as he stood up, finishing off his tea in one last drink. Well then, it was a pleasure talking to you, Hataki-san, but if you'll excuse me, I have work to do in the village. There's a man there who has been bedridden for a week with a strange fever that is slowly turning his hair white. Kakashi just nodded, watching the blonde walk away with his one good eye. Medical ninjutsu is a rather strange thing for a monk to know, isn't it? Naruto paused mid-step as he turned to face the masked jounin again. I suppose it is, but I have been blessed with many friends on my travels as well as good senseis. Besides, isn't it more strange for a non-Uchiha to have a Sharingan? With that he turned and walked away, leaving Kakashi to frown briefly before it was masked by his usual lazy expression. He watched the shogi game for a bit, but quickly grew bored. Slow-paced games that involved a lot of strategizing weren't really for him. He got up and walked into the house, passing Kiba and Sakura bickering like they normally did. It was Sasuke's turn to guard Tazuna at the bridge, so he was conspicuously absent from the room they were occupying upstairs. It could be Naruto, but I'm still not sure. The masked jounin sat himself down on the bed, wincing as his still aching body protested, a thoughtful expression hidden by his mask. He has Minato-sensei's hair, but being blonde isn't really enough to go off of. He doesn't have the whisker marks, but he could always be covering those with makeup. If only I could see his eyes, or if the Hokage had simply told me where Naruto went all those years ago. Kakashi sighed heavily to himself and put his head in his hands wearily. All the Hokage had told him was that Naruto was in a safe place outside the village. Kakashi supposed that could mean the Fire Temple, but it could also mean anything else. However, when it had come time for his year to graduate in the academy and Naruto had still not returned, he had begun to grow worried for his sensei's legacy. The Hokage remained tight-lipped about it, but Kakashi could always see the hints of frustration that came every time he brought it up. He looked out of the window in the direction the young monk had gone inside into his mask. What if it is you, Naruto? Sakura wasn't quite sure what to say as she stood there awkwardly behind the mint-haired girl. It was the 5th day since they had arrived in Nami no Kuni and so far, it had just been boring guarding of the bridge every day in shifts. Kakashi had informed them of his suspicions that Zabuza was still alive, and the masked hunter Nin was actually his accomplice. That had led to some chakra control exercises that were fairly easy for Sakura. Control came quite naturally to her even if she couldn't stay on the tree for more than a few minutes. If you are going to sit, do so. Your indecisiveness is rather distracting. Sakura jumped a little as Fu's neutral voice suddenly pulled her out of her thoughts. The mint-haired girl was looking up at her impassively and Sakura took the opportunity to sit down carefully, tucking her skirt underneath her so it wouldn't get too dirty from the ground. For a minute the two simply ate in silence, Sakura trying to think of what to say and Fu content to read the scroll in her hands. What are you reading? Fu suppressed an irritated sigh and simply moved the scroll so Sakura could see it better. However, the complicated diagrams and anatomical drawings on the scroll didn't make much sense to the pink-haired girl, so they lapsed back into silence again. So, what is it like, traveling with a monk like Naruto-san? This time Fu actually did sigh as she slowly rolled up the scroll, storing it in her pouch before turning to look at Sakura with that same, impassive expression. What is it you really wish to say, Hirono-san? The pink-haired girl's eyes widened for a moment at the tense tone Fu spoke with. She had been getting the distinct impression that the girl didn't like her the entire time they had been staying here, but she couldn't remember what she could have done to deserve it. I wanted to know how you became so strong. Fu stared at the girl for a full 10 seconds as her eyes slowly narrowed, searching the girl's face for any hint of a trick. I do not understand what you mean. I became strong because I trained. She didn't miss the slight upturn of Sakura's nose at that. But don't you get all sweaty and grimy? Again, Fu simply blinked in confusion, not entirely sure where the Konoha genin seemed to be going with this. Yes, that is generally the human body's response to intense physical exertion. Again, Sakura's face twisted into one of mild disgust at the prospect. But isn't there a faster way? One that doesn't make you dirty or less good-looking. Fu was quickly becoming tired of this fruitless conversation. Sakura clearly was just fishing for a way to get strength without sacrificing beauty to get it, even if it was only a temporary sacrifice. Fu found such a desire to be shallow and childish, and it was only her natural restraint that prevented her from simply standing up and leaving, that, and the fact that Naruto had encouraged her to try and interact with the genin. There are no shortcuts to strength. Sakura frowned at that before glancing towards the pouch Fu had placed her scroll in. What about that medical ninjutsu? That's mostly just chakra control, right? If you can do it, then I bet I can pick it up pretty quickly. This time Fu's emotionless mask splintered slightly as her eyes narrowed dangerously. What are you implying about me? Sakura's eyes widened slightly as she realized how what she just said might have sounded. Oh no, I just meant that chakra control comes pretty naturally to me, and you're not from an actual village or anything. If possible, Fu's eyes narrowed even further as her previously steady expression turned into a mild glare, making Sakura slightly nervous. You think that a strip of cloth and metal makes you somehow superior to me? Sakura quickly brought her hands up instinctively, waving them in front of her. No, I didn't mean that. She had seen this girl fighting Sasuke, and although she knew Sasuke must have been holding back for her sake, she still seemed incredibly strong. She wasn't the type of person Sakura wanted to anger. Then what did you mean? Sakura paused for a moment, very carefully contemplating her next words, wary of the fact that Fu's expression had once again become neutral, something that was scarier than when she seemed angry. It's just, people go to hidden villages because that's what we do. We protect people because we are the good guys. There was a tense moment of silence before Fu snorted in amusement, making Sakura chuckle nervously at the sudden change in her personality. You are very, very naive. Sakura looked up at Fu, who was looking at her with an expression she couldn't place. It was like a mix of pity and contempt. Shinobi are not the good guys. Your village are not the good guys. Shinobi are nothing more than mercenaries for hire. For every protection mission there is an assassination, for every client you save there is another target you kill, all under the order of the Kage, who in turn answers to the client. Your jobs are based on the desires of the one paying for your work, and have nothing to do with the job being good or bad. Fu stood up, deciding she had enough of this conversation. Naruto could tell her all day to socialize with people, but she refused to have such an inane conversation. Are you saying shinobi are nothing but tools? Fu paused for a moment, considering it. She had once thought that way in Taki, thought that she was nothing more than a tool, a weapon to be pointed at the enemy and let off the leash, figuratively. Of course, Naruto had changed all that, showed her that she was a human beneath the layers of blood on her hands. No, shinobi are people, and like all people there are the good, the bad, and everything in between. However, as long as you follow the orders of your Kage blindly, you are simply an extension of the village. Shinobi can lead happy and fulfilled lives, find love, and even find family. The girl's expression darkened as she turned away, walking off to find Naruto, but never think that shinobi are ever the good guys. She walked off on that note, leaving a gaping Sakura in her wake, her mind reeling over what she had just been told. It was a fairly normal Thursday in Nami no Kuni. There was a light fog rolling in off the coast and the streets were quiet. However, out on the bridge there was only silence. There wasn't a soul in sight as two figures stepped onto the concrete surface of the expansive crossing. The first was a large, muscled man wearing a sleeveless black vest with matching pants and bandages wrapped around the lower half of his face. However, the most remarkable thing about him was the enormous sword strapped to his back, almost as long as he was tall. The second figure was much smaller, wearing the traditional battle kimono of the Kiri Hunter Corp. He had two long sleek bangs framing his face, or would have if it wasn't covered by a white porcelain mask decorated with scarlet designs and engraved with the symbol of Kirigakure no Sato. He carried no visible weapons, but his way of movement showed training in taijutsu. The two looked around curiously, having expected to see a bridge bustling with workers, looking to make the most out of the early morning sun. I sent the workers home as soon as I felt you coming, Momochi-san. Suddenly the two figures were not alone on the bridge as another seemingly materialized from the surrounding fog. Ah, so you're the brat Haku keeps going off to see, Naruto, right? The blonde stepped forward, a pleasant smile on his face as he nodded in the duo's direction. And you are Haku's master, Zabuza Momochi, demon of the hidden mist and member of the first generation of the Seven Swordsmen. Behind his bandages Zabuza gave a shark-like grin with his pointed teeth. Ah, it feels so good to be recognized by the youth of today. His grin faded as he pulled the enormous sever sword, Kubikiribuchu, from his back. Haku told me that you were no threat and I trusted him, so what's the deal? Decided to try and stop us? Naruto just shook his head, sparing a glance as Haku, who looked away as soon as he felt the blonde's gaze fall on him. No, I simply came to offer you a choice. Zabuza's eyebrow rose in curiosity as he placed the blade of his sword against the cold concrete with a resounding ring of metal. As you know, Tazuna will be here in a few minutes with the Konoha shinobi, Kakashi Hatake, along with them. The swordsman grimaced at that. He was still sore from his last bout with the Sharingan user. All I'm asking you to do is turn around and walk away, leave the bridge builder be, and allow this country to finally regain its legs. Zabuza stared at the young boy in front of him, standing there fearlessly before him. Is this some kind of joke, kid? Don't you know who I am? I might be a missing name, but I still have self-respect. I don't just drop a mission halfway through. Naruto sighed, knowing that the bandaged kenjutsu expert would be a lot harder to talk to than Haku. Last I checked, missing Nin slashed their forehead protectors. Zabuza just scowled again, lifting his blade up to rest it across his shoulders threateningly. There's no need for you to do this. The bloodline rebellions are over, you can go home now. Zabuza grunted as Haku turned to look at him, as expectant for his answer as Naruto was. I know, Haku told me what you told him. Naruto almost blinked in surprise at that, his shakuju jingling as he shifted his weight, his expression becoming slightly confused. Then why continue to work for a man like Gato? Zabuza grunted again, a part of him wondering why he was even talking to this kid. Every time Haku had gone out this week he always came back with another story about this brat. He was also smiling a lot recently. Even if I were to believe you, kid, and the bloodline wars really are over, who's to say I would be welcome there? Naruto wasn't sure how to answer that without revealing too much. If he started talking about key figures in the rebellion like Mei or Ao, then it would only raise more questions that he didn't have time for. Isn't it worth the chance? Zabuza went quiet for a moment before another shark-like grin spread across his face. Fine then, kid, soon as we're done with this mission, I'll head on back to Kirigakure and see what's what. Naruto sighed, somehow predicting it would come to this. At the end of the day, Zabuza was known as the Demon of the Mist for a reason. Do you not see what Gato is doing to this country? His voice had almost taken on an imploring tone, however Zabuza just shrugged, the large sword on his shoulders shifting with his weight. A client's a client and the fate of this country really isn't my concern. I've been paid to get rid of the bridge builders, so until I'm dead, or he is, then my job isn't over. His grin turned into more of a sneer as he took a step forward, his blade swinging around to point squarely at the young blonde. So what's it going to be, kid? You going to try and stop me? Naruto sighed before taking a step back, leaning against his shakuja slightly. No, like I promised Haku, I won't interfere with any of the fights. He looked up suddenly, his face a mask of determination and steel as the grip around his staff tightened. But Tazuna is the last hope of this country, and I won't let anything happen to him. Zabuza seemed ready to respond, but was cut off by a loud cheer as 5 more people and 1 dog made themselves known at the end of the bridge. Yahoo! I told you I smelled them. Kakashi nodded to his excited genin as he stepped forward, his eyes scrutinizing Zabuza, Haku and finally Naruto. Good job, Kiba, you know what we planned. You and Sasuke deal with the fake hunter Nin while Sakura protects Tazuna. His eyes lingered on Naruto for a moment longer before turning to face Zabuza. I thought you were alive. Zabuza's grin returned as he once again slung his sword across his shoulders, assuming an easy stance. You can't kill a demon that easily. His sword came down, clanging noisily against the concrete with a bone-chilling sound. You may have caught me off guard before Sharingan no Kakashi, but your little mind games won't work on me a second time. Go ahead, Haku, deal with the little genin. Me and Kakashi have some catching up to do. As the shinobi all suddenly burst into action, Kiba and Sasuke launching themselves at Haku, while Kakashi and Zabuza began to lightly clash against one another, Naruto slunk back, suddenly appearing near Tazuna and Sakura. "Hey kid, you sure you should be out here? It's dangerous." Naruto didn't even look around at Tazuna, although he admired the man's bravery. With the amount of killing intent Zabuza was layering the air with, it was surprising he could still talk. "No need to worry about me, Tazuna-san, I am only here to observe." He smiled brightly, taking his eyes off the ensuing battles for a moment to give the old bridge builder a cheerful grin. "While I'm here you have nothing to worry about." Tazuna could only stare at the blonde that seemed completely unconcerned by the fast-paced fighting going on all along the bridge. Naruto himself was watching Kiba and Sasuke fight Haku. Zabuza and Kakashi were fairly well matched, so their fighting was mostly just quick skirmishes as one tried to find an opening in the other's defenses. The genin on the other hand were putting everything into their fight, apparently having received a great deal of speed from their training over the week that almost put them on par with Haku. That, combined with their somewhat sloppy teamwork, was beginning to put Haku on the defensive. Naruto sighed from where he was leaning against the raised section bordering the bridge. He was here to protect Tazuna, but he also didn't want anything to happen to Haku either. Suddenly there was a slight whisper of air being displaced in a shunshin, and Fu was next to him, her own orange eyes carefully scouting out the battles. "Tsunami and Inari are safe. Gato sent 2 thugs, but they were undisciplined and incapable of fighting a shinobi. I left a few shadow clones behind just in case." Naruto just nodded as his eyes continued to dart about with the genin's erratic movements. He was surprised at one point when Haku began using one-handed seals. He wasn't even aware that such things existed. Suddenly though, the entire tide of the battle seemed to shift as Haku erected what appeared to be a dome of mirrors made entirely of ice around Sasuke and Kiba. From the side Naruto's eyes widened. He had thought there was something odd about Haku's chakra when he was looking at it. He couldn't place it, but it reminded him a lot of some of the people in the bloodline rebellions with Kekkai Genkai. He just hadn't realized what bloodline Haku possessed. The knowledge that he could create ice was surprising, but somehow very appropriate for the boy's personality. Looking at it now, he could see it. His chakra moved slowly through his coils, in some places almost appearing to be static, yet at the same time it was light and airy, unlike earth-natured chakra. He watched, enraptured, as the boy displayed his ability to move at incredible speeds, far surpassing what most jounin could follow, between the mirrors. Sasuke and Kiba stood little chance against the ensuing onslaught of Senbon that practically came as a barrage from every mirror. Naruto was actually worried for a few moments, knowing the consequences if Haku were to kill the genin, at least until he noticed the boy was only aiming for non-vital spots. He breathed a sigh of relief as Sasuke finally slumped to the ground, a pained grimace on his face as the mirrors collapsed into water around them. He was injured and would be sore for a while, but he was definitely alive. Unfortunately, that pleasant thought was cut short, but the sound of birds chirping. "Raikiri." Naruto looked over to spot Kakashi facing down Zabuza, his hand enshrouded by a layer of crackling white lightning chakra. It was so concentrated that it actually hurt to look at slightly for Naruto's chakra-sensitive eyes. Zabuza was held still by a group of dogs, each sinking their fangs into him at different parts of his body, immobilizing him so that Kakashi had a clean shot at him. However, Naruto wasn't the only one to notice this, and as Kakashi charged at the immobile swordsman, the water hanging in the air between them began to crystallize. There was a squelch as a lightning-coated hand passed through flesh. However, silence reigned on the bridge as everybody stared at what just happened. Kakashi seemed especially shocked to have his hand sticking out of the chest of not Zabuza, but Haku instead, having used his speed technique to intercept his Raikiri just in time. The boy smiled as blood dripped from the corner of his mouth before slumping to the floor. Haku. Nobody even saw Naruto move. One moment he was calmly observing the fights and the next he was by Haku's side, his eyes frantically roaming over the boy before staring uselessly at the gaping hole in the middle of his chest. A switch seemed to flick in his mind as suddenly everything around him vanished. It was just him and Haku as his hand lit up in an almost blinding green light. Instantly he was pressing against the wound, forcing his chakra into Haku in an attempt to first stop the bleeding. However, it seemed fruitless as copious amounts of it began to pour over his hands. Many of his arteries had been severed even if the heart itself hadn't been damaged, although Naruto could actually see it, pumping away. He could literally watch each pump of the vital organ grow progressively slower as the light started to fade from Haku's eyes. He seemed to try and speak at some point, but all that came out were half-formed gasps as flecks of blood found their way onto Naruto's clothes, not that he cared. "Please Haku, just hang on." His voice was desperate now as his hands glowed with useless chakra. Vaguely he heard cries behind him, and the sounds of steel ripping through flesh, but it all just sounded like static. Finally, Haku managed to turn his head towards Naruto, a small smile on his lips as he opened his mouth to speak, but all that came out was a single lingering exhale as the light finally left his eyes. Naruto froze there, staring down at the final image of Haku, uncaring of the growing pool of blood he was kneeling in. But it wasn't Haku. It was Shizuka staring up at him with those lifeless glassy eyes. Her vibrant purple hair was stained red as it fanned out beneath her, matching the stains across her kimono top. Naruto just trembled for a moment as he stared down at her limp hand, clasped in his own, a single tear welling up in his eye. No, he didn't want this to be happening again, he didn't want to see this. No. His free hand slowly curled up into a fist as chakra began to seep from his body like a beacon of light. No. His hair began to lift up from the sheer magnitude of the chakra he was emitting, a bright aura forming around his body as the outermost ring of his Rinnegan pulsed energetically. Gedu, Rinne Tensei. There was a brief moment where the images of Shizuku and Haku overlaid for a moment in his mind before he felt faint, his vision going dark as he slumped to the side. He thought he heard somebody calling out his name, but it was all just so fuzzy. Chapter 46, Flame 6. Naruto woke up to a strangely warm object lying on top of him. The weight was noticeable, but not uncomfortable. His mind was slightly fuzzy and his eyelids just felt too heavy to be worth opening, so he simply shifted until the odd weight was resting in the crook of his arm. A smile slipped onto his face as he instinctually tightened his grip around it, finding its presence to be comforting. He still wasn't quite sure what was going on. Memories seemed to be shifting but strangely, slipping away when he tried to focus. There was something about a bridge, but the thought was gone as soon as he tried to catch it, slipping randomly between crackles of lightning and a bright flash of white light. He shifted his weight again, his mind briefly wondering why the weight next to him seemed to groan at that. He ignored it though, trying desperately to sort through his jumble of memories. He was Naruto, that seemed clear to him, yet at the same time it didn't seem quite right. Wasn't he the Mizukage? No wait, he defeated the Mizukage. A frown creased his brow as conflicting thoughts raged in his mind. He was Naruto Uzumaki. Just like that everything came flooding back, or at least it returned to him, Nami no Kuni, the Konoha shinobi, Haku. Just like that his eyelids didn't seem all that heavy as he suddenly shot up, his eyes snapping open. He immediately noticed he was in some kind of clearing out in the forest, but he didn't know where exactly. Haku. He frantically glanced around, ignoring the pain from his eyes as the sunlight stung them like tiny knives. Wait, sunlight? He looked up, noting that somehow it seemed to be earlier in the day than he remembered, which meant he had been unconscious for a full day, or maybe more. That of course had him wondering why he had been unconscious in the first place. He only had memories of rushing over to Haku, the boy's blood on his hands, and the metallic tang in the misty air. He heard a rustle from the bushes across from him, and his head snapped about. However, he sighed in relief when it was Fu that emerged from the bushes, her hair damp from the bath she had obviously taken. She stared at him for a moment blankly before rushing over to him with a whistle of displaced air. One moment she was across from him, the next she was right up in his face, her orange eyes glancing about with obvious concern for him. After she had made sure he was okay, she stepped back, a relieved smile on her face. Naruto had tried to ease her concern, but for some reason he was finding it slightly difficult to speak. "You're okay." He nodded wearily. It felt like his entire body was weighed down with weights. As a Jinchuriki, lacking energy was not something he was used to. A night's rest, and he would always be back to his normal condition. Now though he was lethargic and everything ached, like he had the life force just drained out of his body. He tried to pull himself up to a sitting position, but his arms just collapsed under his weight uselessly. Luckily Fu had already snaked an arm around his back and was propping him up with it. What happened? His voice sounded small and hoarse, not at all like Fu knew him to be. It was disconcerting seeing somebody she had always saw as a tower of strength so helpless. I'm not sure, it might be best to ask Haku that once he wakes up. Naruto blinked in confusion, his mind was slightly fuzzy still, and he still wasn't quite up to speed. Suddenly the warm object that had been pressing into his side re-entered his mind, and sure enough when he looked around, he saw Haku's still form, lying there next to him on the ground. Just the sight of his limp body lying there like that made his body feel heavier with grief. He had watched another friend die right in front of him. Even with all his medical knowledge, he had been able to do nothing. Wait, dead bodies weren't warm. Naruto's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at the boy's body, moving the limp arm that was gently resting over his waist. Dead bodies also didn't breathe, yet Haku's chest was rising and falling slowly anyway, blowing little bits of dirt away from where his mouth was near the ground. Suddenly Fu's words struck and his eyes opened wide as he nearly jumped to his feet in shock. In an instant he had rolled Haku over and was staring, wide-eyed at the spot where before there had been a gaping hole from Kakashi's Raikiri. How? All that remained of it was the ragged hole in the boy's battle kimono, and the slight paleness of the new flesh that had somehow grown to replace what had been lost. However, with the boy's already pale skin tone it was hardly noticeable. Fu at some point had walked over, sitting across from him on the other side of Haku and looking down at the now non-existent wound more stoically, although internally she was still just as amazed as when she had first seen it. I am not sure she frowned as she looked down at the ground, her hands fumbling in a nervous manner Naruto had never seen from her before. Fu was a lot of things, stoic, controlled, passive, and when the situation called for it happy, in a quiet sort of way. However, he had never seen her nervous like this before. Something happened on the bridge, Naruto. The blonde looked up at the mint-haired girl in confusion as he suddenly realized that he had no idea what had happened after he had passed out. As if sensing his question, Fu quickly nodded, looking somewhat glad that she could change the topic. While you were attempting to. She looked down at the body of Haku. She had run her own diagnosis on the boy afterwards and found he was perfectly healthy, unnaturally so in fact. While you were healing Haku-san, the man Gato appeared on the bridge, declaring both he and Zabuza as useless. He had brought many thugs in order to kill him, obviously underestimating the strength of shinobi. Naruto just nodded, rubbing his temple to stave off a coming headache. He could tell that medically nothing was wrong with him, however, he just felt so unbelievably drained. Gato seemed like the type of man who wouldn't keep to a bargain if there was a cheaper alternative. Zabuza called a truce with the Konoha shinobi before slaughtering the majority of the bandits. Naruto winced as the vague memories of metal slicing through flesh and the screams of many dying men rushed to the surface. He had mostly ignored everything as he attempted to heal Haku fruitlessly, however they had still been there. He managed to kill Gato eventually, but by that point he had sustained many injuries from both his fight with the bandits and with Hatake. As far as I can tell, he would have died without the appropriate medical attention. Naruto nodded before pausing and looking up. Fu just sighed as she realized what he was wordlessly asking. I do not know what happened, I was forced to flee before then. Naruto's eyes widened in surprise at that, wondering if the Konoha shinobi had betrayed them. Once again though Fu seemed to be able to read his thoughts, making him wonder how she seemed to be able to so easily predict his questions. Naruto, something happened back there on the bridge. The girl shuddered suddenly, as if remembering something horrible. Something appeared as you were trying to heal Haku-san. Naruto at this point was confused, wondering why the normally blunt girl before him was suddenly skirting around the subject like mentioning it would bring back whatever she had seen. What was it? Fu looked up from where he had been staring at the ground again. I don't know, I could only see a faint blur where it was but. Her eyes drifted down again until she was looking at the missing hole in Haku's chest, but whatever it was dark, and trying to look at it was like trying to stare at the sun. It hurt, and I instinctively wanted to look away. She shivered again at the memory of that thing that had appeared on the bridge in a burst of purple flames. Naruto's eyes suddenly widened when he remembered more of what happened on the bridge, more specifically just before he fell unconscious. Fu? The girl looked up again, still looking visibly shaken by whatever she had seen. Did I say something back on the bridge? Fu blinked before looking up and thought, doing her best to suppress the memories. In honesty, she had been far too shocked to even try and remember something like that. I think you shouted something, maybe something like get dash. Do, Rina Tensei. The words just came naturally to Naruto, as he found himself just instinctively finishing Fu's sentence. Fu just blinked as she was cut off before nodding slowly. She had been distracted, but that sounded about right. Is it another path? Naruto nodded slowly, a frown on his face. If that was it, then this would be the sixth path, the last if the sage's moniker was anything to go on. Is that not a good thing? You healed Haku with it, didn't you? Is that what it does? Naruto just kept frowning as he looked down at Haku, still sleeping peacefully on the ground. No. He placed a hand on the boy's chest just to reassure himself that the ice user really was alive. I saw Haku die, his heart stopped beating, and I saw his final breath. He winced slightly as he remembered that. Luckily, Fu seemed to have washed the blood off his hands at some point, otherwise he would still be covered in it. Unfortunately, she couldn't do much for the many stains across his robes. He would most likely have to get new ones. Fu was staring at him strangely, wondering if Naruto maybe just imagined it. After all, Haku was right there, breathing steadily. Naruto, you can't mean. She trailed off, not really sure what to do if she had to finish that sentence. Naruto simply nodded, not meeting her eyes as he continued to stare at Haku, his mind reeling over the information of just what he had done. Actually, that might explain what happened to you. Naruto looked up, confusion written across his face as he caught Fu staring at him strangely. He couldn't decipher the look at all. What do you mean? Fu frowned before reaching into her pouch, withdrawing a small hand mirror which she quickly handed to the blonde. Still confused, Naruto looked at his reflection only for his eyes to widen slightly in surprise. Instead of the reflection he remembered, the one he knew he had just a few days ago, a different Naruto stared back at him with those entrancing violet eyes. The changes were slight, probably unnoticeable to most, but for Naruto he couldn't help but see them. His face had become just a little more angular, and his hair had grown longer, quite a bit longer, as he could now feel his spiky ponytail brushing his lower back. At the front it now hung messily over his headband, only the twin horns managing to poke up from out of the messy blonde tresses. Not only that, but for some reason he now had a single white streak running through his hair. Finally, he noticed that his whisker marks had now completely vanished. All in all, minus the white streak, he looked a few months older. However, to Naruto, his face was almost unrecognizable. What happened to me? Fu just took back the small mirror. She didn't have an answer for her friend, although she did have a few strange thoughts about the fact she rather liked Naruto's new look. I cannot say, although I imagine it must have to do with whatever it was you did to Haku-san. Fu bit her lip for a moment, once again making Naruto notice how strange such an action seemed for her, even if it was rather endearing. Naruto, I have heard of jutsu that can revive a person shortly after death before. Naruto somehow felt slight weight lift from his shoulders at that, although he couldn't say why. However, all of them are at the expense of the user's life. Naruto just blinked, uncertain of what to say to something like that. Supposedly he had just accomplished something unheard of, returning somebody's life at seemingly no cost to his own. No. He had to rectify that in his mind, with his change in appearance, most notably the strange white streak of hair, there had to have been some price he paid. He frowned for a moment, the mention of these supposed resurrection jutsu sending his thoughts into a whir. Direct chakra transfer would not work, While your chakra system was tied to your life was not tied to your chakra system. The only way it would work at all is if you were somehow using your own chakra as a medium to directly transfer your life energy into the deceased. Ah, so I somehow resurrect. Naruto frowned for a moment. He didn't particularly like the sound of that. He always thought of himself as a somewhat humble person, and that just seemed too much for him, too godlike. Somehow revived Haku at the cost of my own life force, although apparently only some of it. Fu could only nod. It was the best theory they had right now, and it fit into what she had heard about other such jutsu. Of course, each of those was a closely guarded secret by their respective villages, and often only known by a few people due to them most likely being kinjutsu, so it would be unlikely that they would learn any more. So what do we do now? Naruto scratched his head, pleasantly finding that it was an action he could in fact do even in his weakened form. It was a bit strange to suddenly have all this hair, but he would deal with that in time. He looked around, quickly spotting his Shikuja next to him and grabbed it, using it to lean on. His Fu looked first at him, and then Haku contemplatively. Perhaps we should ask Haku-san. Naruto turned in time to spot Haku blearily opening his eyes, looking just as weak as Naruto did. The boy did manage to at least pull himself up into a sitting position, looking around with a confusion Naruto knew all too well. After all, it must be rather strange to be dead one second and alive again the next. What? Haku blinked for a few moments in an attempt to clear his head. He first looked to Naruto before his eyes widened, and he looked down at his chest, staring at the ragged hole in his clothing. Naruto and Fu stayed silent and allowed the boy to simply take it all in. They weren't sure what the consequences or reviving somebody were, even if it was right after their death. But I was. He suddenly tilted dangerously, only to find himself supported against Naruto, the blonde having shifted to catch Haku. It's all right, just take your time. Haku nodded slowly as he just breathed for a few minutes. Finally, when he seemed to regain his senses, he looked up, purposefully leaning off of Naruto. There was that jutsu, it went right through me. I remember the pain and you? He looked around at Naruto before frowning to himself, occasionally shaking his head as if he didn't quite believe something himself. I healed you. Haku looked up for only a moment before staring back down at his chest where he could spot no visible wound whatsoever, not even a scar. No. I was dead. Naruto widened his eyes slightly at that, wondering how Haku could actually know something like that. Then again, maybe asking where the dead go when they die was a bad idea. There might be some things better left unknown for the living. After a moment of silence, Haku looked up, trying to catch Fu and Naruto's eyes, but found himself unable to as the pair kept avoiding his gaze. Wasn't I? After another tense moment of silence, Naruto simply nodded. He didn't want to lie to Haku about this. Even over the short time he had come to know the ice user, he had begun to see him as a friend, even if their goals had conflicted. Then it wasn't just a dream? If anything, Haku seemed somewhat elated by the news, which was odd, but Naruto didn't pry. However, as soon as his features set into a small, soft smile, they immediately became alert as his eyes frantically searched the clearing he was in. Wait. Zabuza-sama. Where is he? Haku once again found that he was unable to meet Fu or Naruto's eyes as they looked away. An uneasy feeling rose in his stomach. So I failed. The three stood on the crest of a small hill that you could just about see the ocean from. Trees surrounded it on three sides, and in the distance the sun had begun its slow crawl down towards the horizon. Most prominent though was the enormous sword sticking up out of the ground just in front of a conspicuous mound of recently upturned earth. I was unable to protect Zabuza-sama. I was useless as a tool. Behind the boy, Naruto just sighed. Through his conversations with Haku, he had garnered a good idea of just how the boy saw himself. Despite his many attempts to convince the ice user otherwise, he seemed perfectly set in his ways. He was the one who gave me purpose in life, the one who saw in me the potential to have some worth, and I couldn't even give him that. Haku hung his head, unable to look at that large sword that so appropriately represented his master. What was the point of it all, becoming strong? I thought we became strong to protect our precious people, but if I couldn't even do that, then Haku was suddenly cut off as the sound of flesh hitting flesh sounded through the still air, almost deafening in the calm afternoon. Naruto actually blinked in surprise as he saw Fu with her fist buried in Haku's stomach, her eyes narrowed. You are not a tool. Haku staggered back, clutching his stomach in pain as he looked up at the girl shocked. Fu barely seemed to notice his surprise as she squarely fixed him with her orange eyes, blazing with some indeterminable emotion that left Haku unable to look away. You are a human, you have loyalties and people you find precious, but always remember that you did everything that you could, even giving your own life to protect the man you cared about. Zabuza's death was not your fault. If you want somebody to blame, blame Gato, and then let go. Justice has been dealt. Haku just stared at the mint-haired Jinchuriki, silent for a moment as he found words escaped him. But what do I do now? Fu continued to advance forward, her eyes still burning with emotion, until she was right in front of the boy. He half expected her to hit him again, and as he was, lacking energy, and weak from whatever Naruto did to bring him back, he didn't think he could defend against it. He was surprised then when he only felt her hand rest gently on her shoulder, more so when he felt the same thing on his other shoulder. Looking around he saw Naruto there, giving him a warm smile. That's for you to decide, Haku. You are nobody's tool, not anymore at least. It's time for you to make your own decisions. The ice user just blinked, his brown eyes staring almost uncomprehendingly at the blonde for a few seconds. But he looked down, as if he was unsure of how to end that sentence. He turned away from the two, walking slowly over the short distance to the makeshift grave the Konoha shinobi had dug. He was glad at least that Kakashi had respected his opponent enough to do this. Many shinobi would have simply taken the head and the sword for the bounties. Then again, most still thought Kirigakure was in a state of civil war, so trying to cash in bounties there was seen as pointless. Either way, he was glad that Zabuza had at least this much after death. However, he frowned as he stared at Kubikiributsu. Zabuza-sama would have hated this. Naruto looked on curiously as Haku walked forward, wrapping his hands around the extended handle of the executioner blade. With visible effort, Haku pulled the mighty sword out of the ground before staggering back as its sheer weight caught him off guard. He had never actually held the blade before. Zabuza was more protective over it than anything else, and he felt slight awe just staring down its gleaming length. He noticed Naruto had walked up beside him, and was also looking at the blade in thought, so Haku quietly clarified. He would have hated knowing that his blade was going to waste, rusting away as a pointless grave marker. The ice user sighed, the faintest hints of a melancholic smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I believe Zabuza-sama always wanted to go down in a fight. I think it's the way all swordsmen wish to die, never giving up until the end. He shifted the blade in his hands, finding he was barely strong enough to keep it raised like it was. I think he also wanted to reform the swordsmen. He always talked fondly of his fellow members, even if I think most of them outwardly hated each other. At this point Naruto was sure Haku wasn't even talking to them as much as he was talking to the sword itself. Is that what you want to do? Haku paused for a moment, his hand trailing the metal of Kubikiributsu slowly before he stopped, a look of sadness crossing his face. No, that was always Zabuza-sama's dream. He stared at the sword for a moment, unsure of what to do with it now that he had taken it from the earth. I could never be a swordsman anyway, it is not suited to my style. Zabuza-sama always said so. He told me it was disappointing, he had nobody to pass on his skills to. Haku looked down at that. It had always been a secret shame of his that he could never be the apprentice Zabuza had always wanted, just another way he had failed as a tool. What do you want to do, Haku? He looked up, once again noting that Naruto's strong hand was on his shoulder. Being that the most amount of comfort Zabuza would ever show him openly was some small praise after a spar, he found it to actually be very reassuring. I don't know. Naruto only smiled warmly. Then what is it that you enjoy doing? Haku looked down at the blade again, seemingly drawing strength from it as if it could directly channel Zabuza himself. He didn't know how to answer that. Everything he had done he did for Zabuza's sake. Tools weren't allowed hobbies, they weren't allowed comforts or enjoyments. Haku hated violence of all kinds and the thought of actually killing made him feel ill. However, he would have abandoned all of his beliefs had Zabuza simply given him the order. Now that he thought about it, there was only one thing he ever did that did not further his training in becoming a more efficient weapon. I like to heal. Zabuza would get injured a lot, so I had to find ways of helping his recovery. Naruto smiled at that. He remembered how he had first met the boy, with the basket of herbs under one arm. I liked doing it because it not only meant I was useful to Zabuza-sama, but I didn't have to hurt anybody. Another small smile tugged at the boy's lips. Learning how to heal while on the run from Kiri's hunter-nin was difficult, but it was worth it to help his master. That's a good start. Haku, despite himself, found he actually responded to Naruto's warm smile, the corners of his mouth inching up slightly. Haku remembered when he first met Naruto, how the boy had so easily seen what it was he had been preparing. He also recalled many of the villagers talking of him as some great healer, able to fix any injury and cure any illness. Your sensei. Haku looked around at both Naruto and Fu, assuming that because they traveled together they must have both had the same teacher. Do you think they would be willing to take on a new student? The boy watched with apprehension as a look was exchanged between the two Jinchuriki. It wasn't a particularly good look. Our sensei wasn't the most sociable person. It took a lot for us to convince her to train us even a little. Naruto looked around idly, but found his eyes naturally gravitating towards Zabuza's sword. It was just too interesting not to look at. She also travels a lot. Last time it took us weeks to track her down, and back then we at least knew what country she was in. He didn't mention the fact he could literally just summon Tsunade to them at that very moment. He didn't think the woman would be all that pleased. Haku, however, seemed crestfallen. Becoming a medic seemed like a good idea. He could finally help people instead of hurting them. We could always train you. Both boys looked around at Fu, surprised at her suddenly speaking up, although almost immediately a large grin tried to force its way onto Naruto's face. That's a great idea. Haku's eyes widened a little, shocked by the ease with which these two were talking about just allowing him to accompany them. Not only that, but they would be willing to teach him how to be a medic, quite possibly the only thing he had left now that his master was dead. I don't know what to say. Naruto's grin died down into a friendly smile as he placed a warm hand on the boy's shoulder. You don't have to say anything. It's good to travel with new people, and I already know you will be a good friend. Haku just nodded slowly before looking down. He imagined that if he wasn't as socially stunted as he was, he might have cried at the affectionate gesture. As it was, he simply gave the two a small but heartfelt smile. Thank you, the both of you. Naruto just maintained his smile while Fu gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. However, Naruto seemed to get over it quickly as he looked at the large sword Haku was still struggling to hold. So, what are you going to do with that? Haku blinked. After pulling it out of the ground he hadn't thought too much about it, but suddenly the answer seemed too obvious. I wish to return it to Kirigakure. If what you say is true, and the rebellion is over, then maybe they are looking to re-establish the swordsman. This will help them do that and at the same time, hopefully accomplish Zabuza-sama's dream in some small way. Haku frowned though when he shifted the sword in his hands. He could just about lift it, but taking it all the way to Mizu no Kuni seemed like a bit of a stretch. Although I'm not sure how to do that. Naruto walked over, looking the sword over as if checking its dimensions. Once he seemed satisfied, he nodded before taking out a small scroll from a pouch underneath his robes. Not a problem. He reached for the sword and after a moment of hesitation Haku handed it over. To his immense surprise, Naruto simply took the blade one-handed, holding it up like it was made of card instead of steel. The blonde caught the incredulous look the ice user was giving him and smiled sheepishly, rubbing the back of his head as he continued to hold the blade aloft with ease. My sensei was very strong. I picked some things up along the way. Haku just nodded dumbly. There would be time to get to know Naruto later if they really were going to travel together. A moment later and the sword was safely sealed away inside the scroll. Haku was no stranger to Fuinjutsu. After all, Zabuza had a seal on his chest he could use to summon Kubikirabucha back to him if it was lost, or if an opponent managed to get it away from him. Once the scroll was safe in Haku's possession, Naruto looked up, still smiling warmly. "Alright, do you have everything?" Haku nodded after a moment of thought. He always carried everything he owned anyway, a habit bred from being on the run from Hunter Neen for so long. "Well then, let's go." And just like that, Haku made 2 new friends, the first real friends he had ever had. Despite the sadness over his master's death, the uncertainty he felt over this new chapter in his life, and the slight unease he still felt from simply being alive again, Haku felt oddly excited about it all. 2 figures trudged a path towards a house hidden away in the forests covering Nami no Kuni. The smaller one walked with stiff, jerky steps. Her entire demeanor screamed of shock, and they appeared distracted. The taller one seemed more relaxed, but had 2 medium-sized bundles slung over his shoulders. Both almost sighed in visible relief as they approached the front door to the modest, but still homely house. After the man had set down the 2 bundles in the beds upstairs, he had gratefully joined his smaller companion, collapsing into a seat at the kitchen table, and just staring at the wood for a moment. "S-sensei?" Kakashi looked up and immediately regretted it because Sakura looked terrible. Her hair was frayed and her eyes bloodshot, but she was also trembling slightly. The man could somewhat understand how the girl felt. He was a seasoned jounin, and it was still unsettling. He could only imagine how bad it must have been for the still relatively fresh genin. "What is it, Sakura?" Kakashi sounded as tired as he felt. The fight with Zabuza was exhausting enough, but he had to pile on top of that the 20 shadow clones he had created in order to scare of the remainder of Gato's thugs. Not only that, but he had then been forced to lug his 2 male students, who were not particularly light, back to Tazuna's house due to them being knocked unconscious by the fake Hunter Neen. What was that? The masked jounin just sighed wearily as he rested his elbows on the kitchen table. He wanted nothing more than to walk upstairs and just fall into a futon. "I don't know, Sakura." The girl was still trembling, which just made Kakashi groan internally. Whatever it was that had been summoned to the bridge seemed to have put a deeply ingrained fear into the girl, and for good reason. Kakashi had faced many terrible and powerful killing intents over the years. He had even once sparred with the Sandaime Hokage, and the man's sheer chakra presence was enough to send most jounin running. However, a lot of that paled in comparison when he thought of that thing back on the bridge. He didn't even know what it was. But it was. She shuddered again, and Kakashi knew that he would have to get the girl evaluated when he got back to the village. It seemed she couldn't finish her sentence, so Kakashi just laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Go upstairs and get some sleep, Sakura, you'll feel better afterwards." The girl just nodded shakily before getting up to leave. Kakashi didn't trust his own words though. He felt as though even he might have nightmares tonight. As Sakura left, the main door opened again, emitting Inari and Tsunami, obviously back from the celebrations the villagers had been having at the bridge. Luckily, all of them, armed with whatever makeshift weapons they could grab, had arrived shortly after Fu had run off with both Naruto and the fake Hunter Neen, for whatever reason. "Tsunami-san, could I trouble you for a moment?" The woman looked up at him, a happy smile still on her face that perfectly matched the one spread across Inari's features. "Of course, Kakashi-san, what is it?" The jounin nodded, glad that he seemed to have himself under control. It wouldn't do for him to stutter like his cute little student. "What can you tell me about Naruto?" Tsunami just blinked at the question before a look of slight worry marred her features. "Did something happen to Naruto-san?" Kakashi just waved the woman's concerns off quickly as Inari looked between the two in confusion. No, nothing like that." Tsunami sighed in quiet relief, and Kakashi had to marvel at how much an impact the young blonde seemed to have had on the village after only a few weeks. "Well then, what is it you need to know? Did you not talk with him?" At this, Inari seemed to nod vigorously. To the young boy, Naruto was like an idol and could do no wrong. "Yeah. What do you want to know about Naruto Nizan? I mean, you already know he's a super cool monk and he can heal anything. Plus, he has those really cool eyes and he told me his staff was really dangerous to touch, so I bet that's really cool too. And dash, the boy was cut off mid-rant as Kakashi put a hand on his shoulder, his one visible eye looking surprisingly serious for the moment. What do you mean about his eyes? Chapter 47, Perspective Eye. Naruto had grown to appreciate the nights out in High no Kuni during his time at the temple, and during his travels he had honestly missed it. He remembered sitting up on the roof with Sora, neither of them having to say anything, and just staring up at the sky. It was always so clear without all the light pollution you got in the towns or even the hidden village. Every star was crystal clear hanging against their pitch-black backdrop. All that would permeate the still night air was the ever-present rustling of the countless trees of High no Kuni's forests, and the gentle sounds of cicadas chirping. In all, Naruto couldn't begin to imagine a more serene or peaceful atmosphere, and he had been to enough places now to be sure of that. The three of them had left Nami no Kuni shortly after Haku had decided to come with them, crossing the water separating the island from the continent by simply running across. Naruto had been reminded of the time he had crossed between Kaminari and Mizu, as he had been forced to carry Haku part of the way. It quickly became obvious Haku was not the chakra powerhouse that Fu and Naruto could profess to be, although he did have exceptional control that made up for it. Now, though, the trio was camped out in the expansive forests that practically covered High no Kuni. It had been almost a week since Zabuza's death, and Haku was slowly getting used to traveling with somebody other than his late master. Naruto made it as easy as possible for him, making sure the boy was always surrounded by a welcoming atmosphere. It seemed to have somewhat backfired though, as occasionally he would spot Haku looking at him strangely, almost with awe in his eyes. He certainly did not want to be Zabuza's replacement as Haku's master, and how he could prevent that from happening was quickly becoming a concern for the blonde. He sighed on the travel mat he had laid down. Despite the comforting atmosphere and warm night, he just found that he couldn't sleep. Quietly he slipped out of Fu's arms, making sure not to wake the girl that had somehow slipped into his bed almost without him noticing, and stood up, deciding against taking his shikuju for the moment. For a moment he just looked around at the small camp they had set up. At the center was a smoking pile of ashes that had been a campfire only a few minutes ago, and across from it was the conspicuously empty sleeping mat that Haku should have been lying on. Immediately Naruto stretched out his senses through the water vapor in the air, sighing in relief when he felt Haku just a short distance away from the camp, sitting up on a high branch in a tree. It only took him a few seconds to travel the distance, landing silently behind the boy before taking a seat next to him. Having trouble sleeping? Haku looked around slowly before sighing lightly and looking back up at the sky. From the branch they were sitting on, they had a great view of the surrounding forest, and in the distance, they could see the warm glow of a nearby town. When I try, I always have the same dream. Naruto just stayed silent, content to allow his new friend to talk in his own time. I'm back on the bridge, running towards Zabuza-sama as Hatake closes in with his lightning jutsu. Everything seems to be going in slow motion, and I feel like I'm moving through water. For some reason I can't use my Kekei Genkai, like my chakra just refuses to work for me. The water vapor around his hands suddenly condensed as Haku reassured himself he still had his abilities. However, the more I run, the farther away they seem to get. He leaned forward, head down, as another lonely sigh escaped his lips. I always wake up just before the jutsu hits, but by that time I'm almost too far away to even see them. I just feel so helpless, like I was on the bridge. The boy finally looked up, staring briefly at the sky before looking around to Naruto, a questioning look overtaking his features. What do you think it means? Naruto looked at Haku for a moment. The face that had been so innocent when they first met seemed haunted. Bags had begun to form under his eyes, and he looked incredibly tired. I don't know, I'm sorry. Tsunade had always been about healing physical things. Matters of the mind were not her area of expertise, even if she could heal the physical trauma of psychological attacks. Haku just sighed as he slumped forward again, this time staring down at the forest floor far below them. The drop may have seemed long to a civilian, but to the both of them it was barely anything. I suppose it could mean a lot of things. I don't profess to be any kind of expert in dreams, but to me it seems like you are stuck in the past. Haku looked up, the questioning look returning as he stared at the blonde. What do you mean? Naruto just looked away, his face becoming thoughtful for a moment as he stared up at the stars. In his childhood he had enjoyed staring up at the stars. For some reason it always made him feel less lonely knowing there was an entire sky above him filled with those little twinkling pinpricks of light. I know how it feels to lose somebody you care for, to feel helpless over their death. He looked back down, catching Haku's brown orbs for a moment as he smiled softly. However, you can't hold on to them selfishly like that. Before Haku could say anything, he raised a hand, quieting his protests. Always cherish their memory, never forget them. His smile became sadder for a moment, but it could almost have been a trick of the light for the time it lasted. But allow them to rest in peace. You have to accept Zabuza's death. Haku opened his mouth to speak, but found words failing him, so for a few moments the two just sat there in silence. I'm not sure if I can. Naruto just smiled and patted his friend on the back comfortingly. It's not an easy thing to do. Trust me, if I could go back and do something, anything to save Shizuka, then I think I would. Haku looked around curiously at the blonde. Shizuku? Naruto's smile lessened for a moment. That's a story for another time. Haku just nodded in understanding. He had plenty of opportunity to get to know Naruto and Fu in the future, including their pasts. However, Naruto could still see a troubled expression on the young ice user's face. That's not the only thing troubling you, is it? Haku looked up, slightly surprised Naruto had noticed before looking back down, suddenly finding his hands incredibly interesting. No, there was something else. The dark-haired boy frowned before shaking his slightly. But it's nothing, I don't even know if it was real. Naruto said nothing for a while as they lapsed into silence again. This time there was a strange tension hanging between them. It seems important to you anyway. Haku just nodded slowly, silence overtaking the duo again as Haku just continued to stare ahead. Naruto, what do you think happens to us when we die? The blonde looked around sharply, his eyes widening slightly in surprise at the sudden question. He blinked, noticing that Haku hadn't turned. He simply looked down at the ground with an unflinching gaze, unmoving. Finally, Naruto sighed. I really haven't given it much thought. A soft smile slipped onto his face as he looked up at the sky. I like to think that we go somewhere good where everybody we think of as precious is waiting for us. He sighed wistfully, the briefest image of Tsuchi, Ayame and Shizuka flashing across his vision. But then again, maybe death is simply the end and we simply cease to be, making room for the next life to come into the world. He looked across at Haku for a moment, silently for a moment, wondering why he had lied like that. After Shizuka had died he had given it a lot of thought, especially considering he had literally held what most likely been Yagura's soul in his hand. It just seemed like the right thing to say, and it at least seemed to bring a little peace to Haku as he finally looked up. Naruto gave the boy a warm smile as he gently patted him on the back, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. But I should be asking you, right? After all, you were the one that came back. Any hint of warmth on Haku's face almost immediately faded as his expression turned downcast. Naruto regretted his words as the boy next to him frowned, a slightly pained expression flitting across his features. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean. Haku just held up a hand, waving away Naruto's apology quickly. No, it's all right, I know what you mean. It's just... The boy frowned again as he stared intently at the ground. When I was... Haku paused to choose his words carefully. Gone, I didn't just stop. In fact, I remember it. Naruto's eyes widened again in surprise. I don't know if it was just a dream or some kind of hallucination, but at first, I was walking through this black space. It seemed so vast and infinite that I felt lost just looking around. The boy looked back at Naruto, seeming to gain some confidence as he talked. I don't know how long I was gone exactly, but it seemed like I was there for at least an hour. At some point I spotted a light, and when I walked over it was like stepping into a different world. One moment I was surrounded by darkness, The next I was in Mizu no Kuni, out in one of the forests. It was night and very dark, I could barely see 20 feet in any direction, but I had walked into some kind of camp. The previously pained expression tuned into a saddened smile, as the boy glanced back to their own camp. My mother was there. She said she had been waiting for me for a long time, even though she was sad that it had come so soon. I didn't know what to say to her, but she got up and hugged me, telling me how sorry she was for what happened. Slowly, as the boy spoke, his smile gained warmth as his eyes drifted off, remembering as much as he could of that dreamlike encounter. I cried for a while and she just held me, whispering that she was proud of the good life I had tried to lead, proud that I had stuck to my beliefs and never killed anybody, not becoming the weapon she never wanted me to become. Haku's smile dimmed again, and when he looked back around at Naruto, tears were percolating at the edge of his eyes. Before I could say anything, everything seemed to glow green. My mother just looked at me happily and told me that it wasn't my time yet, and she would still be there, waiting for me when it did finally come. Suddenly his entire demeanor shifted as a hint of pink entered the boy's cheeks. He shifted nervously on the branch and coughed into his hand. Then she told me to find a girl to settle down with so that she could have the grandchildren she had always wanted. Naruto had to stifle a small chuckle as Haku composed himself again, shaking his head to rid himself of the embarrassing thought. After that, I woke up in that clearing with you and Fu. Naruto just took it all in for a moment in silence, absorbing what Haku had told him as the boy looked at him expectantly. Do you think it was real? Naruto stayed impassive, his face revealing nothing as he looked away, once more drawing strength from the stars above them. I don't think it matters. Haku looked around, shocked, but more so curious about Naruto's response. Naruto just gave him a smile as he stretched his arms out, suddenly feeling rather sleepy. Whether it was a dream, or a hallucination or not, all that matters is that you experienced it. Do you feel better knowing that your mother is proud of your life? Haku nodded slowly and Naruto's smile grew. Well then it's real, because you can use that feeling and continue to make her proud. Haku just blinked at that, leaning back on his hands as he just sat there silently, taking that in. Finally, a soft smile of his own settled on his face as his whole body seemed to relax. Thank you, Naruto, I think you're right. Naruto just nodded happily, noting that Haku was starting to sway on the branch a little as their respective exhaustion from the long walk that day hit them both. Good, now come on back to camp, we'll need some rest if we're going to get all the way to Karigakure. Haku just nodded tiredly as he allowed Naruto to lead him back to camp. He spared one last look up at the sky before yawning and following the blonde, the small smile never leaving his face for even a moment. Hey Temari, wait up. Sand blew lazily across the ground, picked up by the wind into a small whirlwind of dust that was common in Sunagakure. A tall girl with sandy blonde hair, tied back into 4 short ponytails, turned in the street, shifting the large black object on her back. It was heavy, and even though she had been using it for years now, it was still somewhat uncomfortable. Unfortunately, her father insisted on her always carrying it. When she turned, she spotted a much shorter girl rushing down the street towards her. Matsuri, what is it? She gave the girl a moment to catch up with her as she had obviously run quite a distance to find her. Finally, the younger girl stood up straight, brushing her hair out of her face with a smile. Baki-sensei wants to see us all, something about the upcoming Chunin exams. Do you think he wants us to enter them? Temari just smirked at the younger girl, reaching forward to brush her soft, shoulder-length hair over one ear. After Gara had left the village, Temari had taken a turn for the worse. She somewhat blamed herself for not being there for her brother enough. For a long time, she was lacking energy in her training. It just didn't seem to be worth it anymore. Sure, she was still the daughter of the Kazekage, and as such many things were expected of her, but she just didn't see the point if she couldn't protect her baby brother. Of course, he wants to enter us. Hell, Kankuro and I have been ready for at least a year, and we all know how far you've come along. The younger girl beamed at the praise. A few years ago, she had been the talk of Suna, graduating almost 3 whole years early from the academy. Suna hadn't had a true prodigy since Akasuna no Sasori, and her father had used the opportunity to fill the spot Gara had left on the team they would have formed. At first it was odd working with somebody so much younger than them, but Matsuri was dedicated and highly competent. It certainly helped that she had a secondary affinity to wine, which immediately made Baki take a shine to her. Cool, we better go find Kankuro then. Temari just smiled. She had come to see Matsuri as somewhat of a little sister, and it felt nice to finally have a younger sibling she could dote on. Deep inside her though, she still wished that she could see her little brother one last time, just to apologize that she couldn't be the big sister she should have been. With a small sigh she allowed the younger girl to pull her along. She was sure that whatever Baki wanted to see them about would be important. He didn't usually call them on their free days. Stop moving around so much, bitch. A cruel laugh filled the night air, accompanied by the sounds of struggle and muffled, but still defiant murmurs of protest. A large burly man with a rusty blade strapped to his back walked along the outskirts of a small town in Tano-kuni, heading back towards the camp where he and his friends had set up for the night. He had a smile on his face, knowing it was worth it as his free hand shamelessly groped the young girl he had carelessly slung over his shoulder. Hey, I said, knock it off. He squeezed harder on the soft flesh he had been fondling, as the girl once again tried to lash out at him with her legs in a futile effort to make him drop her. All he heard was her quietly whimper in pain, doing her best not to give him the satisfaction of her screams. The bandit just grinned again. He loved it even more when they fought back, as it made the whole experience more rewarding at the end. He frowned as the dust in front of him picked up slightly, making him shield his face. He just ignored it, putting it down to the wind. Put her down. The man grunted in annoyance as a gravelly voice cut off his pleasant stroll, forcing him to turn around and face the newcomer. He was actually a little surprised when he turned, expecting the low voice to have come from a man. Instead, he found himself looking at a young boy with rusty maroon hair and thick black rings around his eyes. Fuck off, kid, can't you see I'm busy here? The boy's face didn't change in the slightest, actually unsettling the thug slightly with the intensity of that impassive, emotionless glare. I said to put her down. Just like his face, the boy's voice didn't shift from that deadpan, gravelly tone that made small shivers run down the man's back. He shook them off though, drawing his long but poorly maintained blade with the hand he wasn't using to hold the teenage girl against his shoulder. Really? And how the fuck are you going to make me You're just a little dash. The man never got to finish his sentence as the ground beneath him suddenly lurched, bursting open as if a door to hell was opening beneath his feet. He was surrounded on all sides by large walls of sand, and he had just enough time to scream for a second before they collapsed inwards, crushing his body ruthlessly. When the dust finally cleared, the girl was laying there dazed on the ground, surrounded by sand with no sign of the brute that had been carrying her. Are you okay? Her head snapped around at the voice of the young boy, looking completely unconcerned that he had just mercilessly destroyed that bandit without any effort. Why yeah, I guess. The boy just nodded before offering his hand. The girl took it gratefully as she allowed herself to be pulled off the ground. Thanks. The boy looked up at her, his expression still hadn't changed, which was slightly unnerving, but he had saved her from the brute of a man, so she owed him a lot. Gara. The young girl nodded nervously. It sounded like a Kaze no Kuni name, and she wondered why one of their shinobi would be all the way out here. After all, he couldn't fathom how he could do what he did with the sand if he wasn't a ninja. I'm Sasami. Gara simply nodded impassively again as the girl brushed down her clothes. She had long orange hair flowing down her back, forming two straight bangs at the front that framed her face. You should get back to your village soon. The girl nodded quickly and gave the boy a wan smile. Thanks. Is there anything I can do to repay you for, saving me? Gara stared at her for a moment before giving a conceding nod. Some food and a place to sleep for the night would be appreciated. Sasami managed a wider smile as she started walking back to her village. Her clan wasn't too fond of outsiders, but she was sure they could make an exception for somebody who had saved her. Sure, I can do that. As they walked off, a tiny smile appeared on Gara's face, the last 2 years of traveling had been rather kind to him, or at least eventful. At first he had simply wandered aimlessly, unsure of what to do with himself. Somehow, though he always seemed to walk into some kind of trouble wherever he went, it seemed his luck had held true even here. He took a sideways glance at the girl walking beside him before she caught him staring, and he turned away. Briefly he wondered why his cheeks suddenly felt warmer, but ignored it. He hadn't eaten for a day, and he was looking forward to the upcoming meal. He completely missed the hint of pink that had managed to enter Sasame's cheeks when she caught his look. "Hey Kuratsuchi, stop daydreaming about that blonde kid again." A resounding smack of flesh hitting flesh echoed through the stone hallways of the Tsuchikage Tower as Kuratsuchi buried her fist in her partner's stomach. Of course, after a moment Akatsuchi simply stuck his tongue out at the girl, not even seeming to feel the blow that would have decked most shonen. The tomboyish girl's eye twitched at her companion's seemingly invulnerability to her blows as he walked off. "I was not thinking about him, damn it." Akatsuchi just laughed jovially as his footsteps echoed against the stone slabs on the floor. They were deep inside the heart of the mountain that marked the center of Iwagakure, the most protected and heavily defended space in the country, possibly even the continent. Sure, whatever you say." Kuratsuchi growled dangerously at the lumbering boy. Ever since running into that kid a year ago, he had never let go of that one thoughtful look she had sent his way. It wasn't her fault that the kid looked like a spitting image of a younger Yondaime Hokage, widely considered to be an incredibly handsome man, even in Tsuchi no Kuni. Though not handsome enough to make up for all the other things he was considered. Whatever, what does Gigi want now? At that Akatsuchi's jolly grin faded somewhat. She had only ever seen it actually disappear in combat, and had to discern his feelings based on the degree of his grin. This one meant that he was nervous or anxious about something, and combining that with her grandfather, and it didn't bode well. The Chunin exams are in Konoha this time around, and you know what that means. Kuratsuchi just groaned. She had been on a lot of back-to-back missions lately, and the upcoming exams had slipped her mind. Oanoki was always pretty grumpy, but it would only get worse whenever some big event was being held in Konoha. The man held no personal feelings towards any one person there, alive or dead, except perhaps for his longtime rival Hiruzen Sarutobi, but after losing 2 wars to them there was definite bad blood between the two nations. "Damn it, I just got back as well." Akatsuchi just shrugged, his grin growing again as he thought of what was coming up. Around this time, when Oanoki's moods took a dive, he would always lash out at anybody close to him, usually that meant Kuratsuchi due to her habit of walking into his study unannounced. Oh well. Kuratsuchi just grinned evilly at her companion as they continued to make their way to the Tsuchikage's office. "Hey, if I'm going down, I'm taking you with me." Akatsuchi's grin dropped quite considerably at that as his usually rosy cheeks paled, making him freeze in place for a moment. You're just joking, right?" Kuratsuchi simply gave him another sinister smile as she walked off down the hallway. "Kuratsuchi?" The boy groaned pitifully as the girl didn't answer him. With a great deal of reluctance, he followed after her. "I have a bad feeling about this." Mabui sighed slightly as she looked up from her desk. The never-ending stream of documents and files she had to review and sign off on before sending to the rakeage sat to one side, taunting her. Darui stood in front of her, patiently waiting for her to finish the papers she had been looking over, requests from a nearby farming village for protection against raiders that had been bothering the region recently. She had always liked Darui. He was one of Kumogakure's top shinobi, a high A rank. But more importantly, he was a naturally quiet person, something she, as a secretary, appreciated. "If you're waiting to see the rakeage, I would wait for a while, he's in one of his moods." Darui winced slightly at that. As one of the rakeage's most trusted guards when he left the village, he, better than anybody, understood exactly how he could get in one of his moods. "Who's in there with him?" Mabui sighed again, slumping forward slightly. She remembered her past, when she had just been a simple kunoichi, patriotic and naive like all good Kumo shinobi. How times had changed. "It's Yujito." Darui just grimaced. Ever since the girl had her bijou removed by the same person who had stolen the Kahaku no Juhei, she had been short-tempered and irritable. Putting her in the same room as the Raikage was asking for trouble. She had calmed down a lot recently, especially with Karabi's help, but she was still very volatile. It didn't help that everybody knew the Raikage held resentment against her for being defeated and losing one of Kumo's prized and irreplaceable weapons to a child, even if Yujito maintained it had to be a henge. "I'll go then, see you tomorrow, Mabui." The dark-skinned woman just nodded wearily, tapping her pen against the desk as she stared hopelessly at the piles of paperwork she still had to sort through. "Oh Darui, bring your Jinin team tomorrow. The Raikage wants to speak to all the current Jounin sensei about the upcoming Chunin exams." Darui raised an eyebrow at that, wondering what the leader of their village could possibly want to talk about. At that moment though they both heard the telltale sounds of a window shattering before the office door burst open and Yujito stormed out. Despite having her bijou removed, she was an incredibly formidable kunoichi, and many people immediately rushed to get out of her way. The blue flames encompassing her hands was also good incentive. Should we be worried about that? Darui looked around but found Mabui to be ignoring him, once again engrossed in her work. He simply sighed and strolled out. It was getting too dull for him anyway. It was dark and cold, and the air reeked of disinfectants mixed with blood. Most of the time these conditions would be a warning sign to most people. Of course, Orochimaru was not most people. As he walked down the corridor of one of his many hidden bases scattered around the elemental nations, he was smiling. It was a sick, twisted perversion of what most would call a smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. He was in high spirits as the groans and screams of test subjects rang out around him, echoing off of the uniformly patterned walls that made his bases maze-like and disorienting. Of course, his companion didn't seem to be nearly as appreciative of the dank environment. They moved beside him with a dark expression on their face, mostly hidden by the wide hat they wore, decorated on the front by the symbol of their nation. Orochimaru ignored this though. He didn't expect people to find pleasure in knowledge and understanding as he did. It was enough that he knew. In fact, he couldn't care less about other people save as a means to an end, or in the rare privileged case, an interesting test subject. Sure, he could feign compassion, put on a fake smile and a warm facade, but his cold, calculating eyes were always moving, searching for something to satiate his burning curiosity. "You know, I would almost find this little meeting amusing if it wasn't so interesting for me." The man walking beside the snake Sannin just sneered but said nothing, actively avoiding looking at the pale man. "Before the third shinobi wore you, and I would be staunch enemies, and yet now you come to me for help." The other man stayed silent again, wincing slightly as a particularly loud scream cut through the other, still unsavory background noises of the base. "Do not think we are friends, Orochimaru, or allies. You are simply a means to an end." The Sannin just chuckled slowly, his tongue flickering out between his lips much like the animal he took after. "Oh, now that I can understand, I think I will enjoy this little endeavor." Orochimaru's companion just looked at him in disdain before continuing on down the dimly lit corridor. "I hope you understand your role in all this though." The other man grunted as if that was an acceptable answer, not stopping for a moment. He just wanted this meeting over so he could get out of these dank corridors. "I understand, but what makes you think the boy will even be there?" Orochimaru just gave another twisted grin as he caught up to the man. "Oh, I don't, but I do know just how powerful nostalgia can be." The other man just nodded quickly before moving on. Orochimaru watched him leave from the shadows of his base, his slitted yellow eyes almost glowing in the dim lighting of the candles. Working with a Kage, how interesting. Chapter 48, Inferno I would like to say I'm still against this. Fu's voice rang out clearly along the forest trail the trio were taking. It was deep in the forests of Hai no Kuni and almost exclusively used by shinobi due to the treacherous terrain. And I've already told you there's nothing to worry about Fu. Naruto was a little way ahead of her, his long ponytail swaying gently behind him to the rhythm of his shikuju's jingling. Fu had suggested he cut it, but the blonde had come to like his hair, white streak included. He figured it made him seem more distinguished now that he lacked his whisker marks. You mean besides being captured and forced to stay within the village as nothing more than a weapon? The hint of bitterness in the girl's voice was unmistakable, and out of the corner of his eye Naruto could see her lightly rub her shoulder where her old village headband had once been. It's not going to happen, Fu. They won't even recognize us, and if worst comes to worst we simply leave. Fu snorted at that, but it didn't sound particularly like amusement. Ever since Naruto had declared his plans to return to Konoha, she had been in a foul mood, worsening with every step closer they took. Right, because walking out of a hidden village is so easy. Naruto just smiled at the derisive comment jovially without breaking stride. He knew all these objections were just out of concern for him so he could easily forgive the girl for being stubborn. It's never stopped us before. Fu was silent a moment, but her eyes still narrowed. Technically Naruto wasn't wrong, but before they had plans, methods of getting out and nobody there that might recognize the blonde. In Konoha that would be different. There was a reason it was widely considered the most powerful village in the elemental nations. I still think it's a bad idea. Naruto just chuckled lightly as he dropped back to walk beside the green-haired Jinchuriki. Objection duly noted. You now have the right to say I told you so if anything goes wrong. Fu tried to fight it, but she just couldn't help the small smile that snuck up on her. She just found it impossible to stay mad at Naruto, despite his best efforts to frustrate her, unintentionally or not. Anyway, Haku wants to go, so it's 2 against 1. The aforementioned dark-haired boy who had been trailing a few paces behind them looked up in surprise as he was suddenly included in the conversation. All I said was that it would be interesting to visit another of the hidden villages. Naruto smiled at that, still remembering the odd look that Haku had done his best to hide when they had entered Kirigakure. To be fair though, Naruto had felt the same on the inside, but for different reasons. During the Bloodline Rebellion's Kirigakure was like the shining jewel of Mizu no Kuni. It was the prize everybody was fighting for, representing victory and control for whichever side won. He and Fu had left before ever seeing it in the hands of the rebels. The country had really flourished since the civil war had ended, resources started going back to the people, and the economy and communities were finally given a chance to rebuild. Kirigakure though was something else. It had hardly taken any damage during the war, so after word that Gara had been defeated got out there was only a brief period of resistance before the remaining loyalists surrendered. With the 7 swordsmen either scattered or dead, there wasn't really anybody suited to taking Yagura's place. Kirigakure itself was a beautiful village with rising marble buildings in whites and pale blues with a lot of vines growing along the walls, perfect for the damp climate. The perpetual layer of moisture coating everything just gave the entire village a shine as it reflected the weak sunlight around. In the center of it all, on top of a vast network of aqueducts that ferried clean water about the village, was the Mizukage Tower. It was an enormous circular building that acted as the heart and soul of the shinobi village. Of course, this perfect serene image had been somewhat ruined by a flying orange blur going by the name Nezumairo. As soon as word had spread that Naruto had entered the village, she had practically sprinted over to the group, tackling the poor monk right off his feet. In all, it was a fairly nostalgic moment for everybody. However, Naruto had forgotten that they had left Mizu no Kuni rather suddenly without offering much of an explanation, as evidenced when Nezumairo had asked them where Shizuka was. The mood had instantly taken a turn for the worse. Later on in Mei's office, they managed to extract a more or less accurate account of what happened with Yagura, including Shizuka's death. Naruto did leave out the part about him using his Bijuu's chakra to defeat the Kage, simply telling them he had activated a new aspect of his Rinnegan. Nezumairo had left by that point after consoling him, quite thoroughly, much to Fu's hidden ire, over their friend's death. After that, it had been a much simpler matter of handing over Zabuza's sword. Then came the matter of Haku. After explaining who he was and how Zabuza had found him, Mei immediately sympathized with the ice user. Both of them had their clans wiped out to near extinction during the purges. Unfortunately, while there were still a few Terumi members around, the Yuki clan had been one of the first to be eradicated, and there had been no survivors. Haku took it surprisingly well, and later on he told Naruto and Fu he had already resigned himself to the fact long ago when he had been forced to kill his father in self-defense. After that, Haku had been offered a choice: stay in Mizu no Kuni and work toward rebuilding his clan, or continue traveling with Naruto and Fu. Naruto felt a bit selfish for enjoying the fact Haku chose them, but in their short time traveling together he had quickly become a close friend to both of them. Haku had promised though that when he was older he would return to his village. Until then he wanted to learn more about the world and better refine his bloodline. Mei understood, not wanting to pressure any bloodline clans into doing anything due to what they had all been through. She respected his decision, thanking him for the sword and wished them good luck. However, as they were leaving, she had mentioned the fact that the upcoming Chunin exams were coming up. It was purely because if Haku had stayed she would have considered entering him, but more importantly she noted that they were taking place in Konoha this time around. Just like that, Naruto knew he wanted to return to his village. He wasn't sure if it was melancholy or just a hint of homesickness, despite the village not being his home for over 6 years, but he knew he needed to see Konoha again. Right now, they were just a few miles away from the village itself. They hadn't been traveling at ninja speeds, so the entire journey had taken around 3 weeks. There was plenty of time for the three to get to know one another, each telling the other about their respective pasts. It turned out they all had far more in common than they had previously thought. All three were orphans, all three knew the loss of a precious person, and all of them knew how it felt to be hated and persecuted for a power they had no control over having. Fu and Naruto learned about Haku's early life with his parents, the day he discovered his abilities and showed his mother, as well as the day he was forced to kill his father after watching the man murder his mother in cold blood, just for being different. They also discovered quite a bit about what he had learned under Zabuza's tutelage about advanced chakra control, speed and his Kekkai Genkai. Luckily Mei had managed to provide him with a few scrolls detailing some of his clan's techniques that had survived the purges, in the hopes that it would serve as incentive for him to return later on. Fu told him about her treatment in the village, how little she had known about the world besides combat and very specific history before being rescued. Other than that, she had very little to tell about herself. Her childhood was about as stunted as they come. If anything, it was more mechanical than natural. Naruto finished up by telling him about his own childhood, how the villages would mostly pretend he didn't exist. Over the weeks Haku earned their trust enough that Naruto showed him his Rinnegan, telling the boy about it and everything he had gone through to fully awaken it to this point. After that the three had a genuine connection, one built on shared experiences and empathy for the other's situation. It was also nice for Naruto to have another boy to talk with. There were just some things he felt uncomfortable bringing up with Fu sometimes, even if she was his best friend. I think we're almost there now. Naruto's voice was outwardly confident as his eyes glanced around at his surroundings. It had been a long time since he had been in High no Kuni except for passing through, and even longer since he had been around the village, and at the time he was only 7. And we are supposed to trust your judgment on this? Over the weeks traveling with the two, Haku had really loosened up, no longer having to conform to any kind of attitude like he did serving under Zabuza. Naruto was sure he wanted to simply shift that relationship onto him, but instead Naruto coaxed him with a friendly atmosphere, and eventually Haku simply accepted the two as friends, nothing more. You're not going to let that go, are you? Naruto's deadpan voice made Fu smirk slightly as she walked behind the two boys. Well, you did get us lost for about a week. Naruto just sighed and put a palm up to his temple. Haku was never going to let it go. The fact that the almighty Rinnegan bearer, the man with the most powerful eyes in the world, managed to get lost in the very forests that were his home. I already told you, the map that man sold us was completely fake. Blamed Fu for buying it off him. At that the mint-haired Jinchuriki sent a mild glare at the blonde before waving casually at the dark-haired boy. Haku was the one who said he seemed trustworthy. Naruto just smirked as he nudged the other boy on the shoulder. I don't think Haku understands when somebody is untrustworthy. It was Haku's turn to send a small glare at the blonde as he crossed his hands in front of his chest, made more difficult by the bulky traveling cloak he was wearing over his clothing. They had decided that a Kiri Hunternin uniform was a bit conspicuous, so at the first town they had come across they had bought Haku some new clothing. Naturally, the boy had chosen quite possibly the most androgynous outfit in there, a simple lilac shirt that seemed far too large for him, leaving the sleeves to hang past his hands and the hem to drape about him like a skirt, as well as very baggy maroon shorts that just came past his knees. Over that he wore a simple but thick sky blue kimono with white trim, similar to the one he wore in his disguise. "And you're one to talk? Are you not the one who was naive enough to believe that talking to me when I was quite obviously hostile was a good idea?" Naruto's smirk flipped to a genuine grin at that as he casually wrapped an arm around Fu's shoulders. "But wasn't it?" Fu's eyes narrowed in mock irritation, but her small smile belied how she really felt. "That's beside the point." Naruto's grin only grew at that. At this point Haku had started to drift behind the pair slightly. It wasn't uncommon for them to start talking and just sort of forget Haku was there. He couldn't blame them, as he had a rather meek presence, and was quite quiet unless prompted. Of course, Naruto immediately noticed him trying to slink back and blend in with the road and immediately grabbed his hand, pulling him back up. "Where are you going? I thought we were talking, and Haku merely offered a timid smile, but really had nothing else to say, so the group lapsed into a brief silence. Luckily for them, it couldn't last too long, as the tree line finally broke before them to reveal a sight that Naruto hadn't seen in over 6 years. "Wow, I never imagined it was so large." Naruto found a grin forming on his features as Haku's odd voice cut through the group's silence. Konoha really was a sight, bathed in the light streaming down from the mid-morning sun, reflecting off of shop windows and metal ornaments hanging in merchant stalls. The many red-tiled roofs of the old and new buildings mishmatched together to create a diverse, ever-changing landscape of traditional and modern housing. The village itself was a sprawling mass of streets and people, spreading out in a large semicircle from the mountain that stood sentinel over it. That was the most impressive part, the Hokage monument, a towering mass of rock and stone that could cast the entire village into shadow if the sun was behind it. Engraved on it were the likenesses of the village's greatest heroes and leaders, the Hokage, past and present. Naruto took a moment to look at the visage of Hashirama Senju, the man who had captured the majority of the Bijou, and handed them out in an attempt to balance the power of the nations. He had caused a lot of problem for the Bijou in his bid for peace, but Naruto couldn't fault him for that. He had been acting in the best interests of his people and didn't know the consequences of his actions. "Yeah, it's really something, isn't it?" Naruto's grin turned into a lopsided smile as he looked out at his home village. It really hadn't changed since he'd been gone. At least not in any ways he noticed. "It's certainly very large." Naruto sighed at that. Fu's tone was clipped and withdrawn, telling of her dislike of the situation. She wasn't very happy with walking into a hidden village after her childhood. He suspected the only reason she had been even remotely comfortable in Kumogakure was due to how soon it was after she had left Takigakure. Now that Naruto thought about it, though, she had been very reclusive and introverted then as well. Kirigakure had been fine because they were constantly surrounded by people she at least knew somewhat and knew mean her no harm. "Well, yeah, I guess it is." Naruto shrugged. He supposed he should be glad Fu was talking at all. He could tell she was secretly unhappy with him for this, even if she wouldn't openly admit it. It took them another few minutes to hike the rest of the way to the village, and most of the way there was a slightly awkward silence between the trio. Naruto couldn't think of what to say to Fu, while Fu simply didn't want to talk. Haku was perfectly fine blending into the silence, as he was used to it at this stage in his life. Eventually the great wooden gates of Konohagakure loomed before them like proud sentinels of the shinobi village. They were opened all the way to admit the many spectators and nobles that had traveled far to see the newest batch of potential chunin. These events were more of a publicity affair than actual tests to determine a rank. After all, most shinobi made their rank through field promotions. The exams themselves were mostly to show off the power in the newest generation, representing the power of their village as a whole in order to draw in clients. Excuse me?" Naruto looked around, noticing the guard sitting in a small box-like building just inside the gate. He blinked as he realized he had been daydreaming before walking over to the guard, a tall man with his dark purple hair hanging out in long spikes with a small strip of a beard and a bandage wrapped across his nose. "Hello, we'd like to enter the village." The man just looked past him at Fu and Haku disinterestedly, probably bored at having to admit so many people, that at least would work in Naruto's favor. He doubted that many would recognize him without his whiskers, but just in case he wore his Tsujigasa to hide at least the top of his hair, the long spiky ponytail he could do little about. "Yeah, you here for the Chunin exams?" Naruto just nodded pleasantly, his usual squinted look firmly back on his face. Traveling with Haku and Fu, who knew all his secrets, he hadn't had to bother, but he definitely couldn't risk people seeing his Rinnegan. Most of these people were highly trained shinobi, and even if they didn't recognize it as one of the legendary three, it was still obviously a dijutsu of some sort. "Alright then, you need to sign a waiver stating you won't cause trouble in the village. Anything you do will be made accountable to you or your friends, and the shinobi will be able to deal with it as they see fit." Again, Naruto nodded, but a small frown flickered across his face. He realized it was a ninja village, but the amount of unquestionable power they held was somewhat troubling. "Well, alright then, you're welcome to get a room in any hotel besides those closest to the training grounds to the east and west of the village. Those are reserved for the foreign participants." Naruto just nodded again, figuring that talking as little as possible would most likely help in keeping his identity secret. "Enjoy your stay in Konoha no Sato, and enjoy the Chunin exams. There should be some pretty cool stuff going on this year, what with the last Uchiha participating." At that, Naruto raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. That would mean that if he stayed, the last Uchiha would have been in his graduating year. As the three walked away from the small stand, he could faintly hear the gate guard whispering to his companion in hushed tones. They obviously didn't expect him to be able to hear them from this distance. "Did you see that symbol on his robes?" The other guard, a man with lank brown hair tied up in a bandana with a strange skin-tight underlay that came all the way up to his chin, just responded with a near unintelligible grunt, obviously far too bored to be looking at people's clothing. "It was the symbol of the fire temple. I wonder what one of their monks is doing out here." Naruto slowed his pace slightly so he wouldn't walk out of range of the two. What do you mean?" "He's probably just here for the Chunin exams like everybody else." His tone conveyed his absolute disinterest with the subject. It appeared his partner would often talk to him about inane things. "They don't usually care about that kind of stuff, right?" The other guard merely shrugged, looking about ready to drop to the desk and just sleep. One of Asuma's brats is in it, right? Maybe he's just here to see him. Maybe he's one of the guardian students come to see another." The first guard just frowned, seemingly unconvinced, although Naruto had a sneaking feeling that he was simply trying to find excitement in his dull day, thankfully for the blonde. "Maybe, but should we report it to the Hokage anyway?" At that, Naruto nearly froze, but managed to just slow his pace again slightly, confusing Haku as the boy hadn't been trying to listen to the two Chunin's conversation. He just let it go, man. Ain't it bad karma or something to mess with monks?" At that, Naruto let out an inaudible sigh, picking up his pace once again. "Yeah, I guess you're right." A soft smile replaced the worried frown that had crept onto Naruto's features, and with more confidence in his step the young monk continued on into the village with his friends. Luckily, they didn't seem to attract much attention. After all, they were just three kids walking through the village. They were dressed a little strangely, but with all the foreigners flocking to Konoha for the Chunin exams, different was the norm. "So where are we going first?" Haku nudged the blonde slightly as they walked, pulling the boy out of his thoughts. The familiar sights and sounds of his childhood home had sent Naruto off into his memories, picking out little details he remembered from when he was 7. The alleyway they had just walked past had been one of his favorite escape routes when running after a prank. There was a little hole in the fence just large enough for his young body to fit through while his pursuers, generally angry prank victims, had to take a longer way. "I want to show you guys around, but first I think we should find a place to stay. The exam's final round isn't for a few more days." Fu just nodded from his right. She had a neutral look on her face since entering the village, but Naruto had known her too long not to recognize the fact she was mentally withdrawing on herself. The mint-haired Jinchuriki was not good with large gathering of people, and you didn't get a much larger or more diverse crowd than the melting pot that was Konoha. So, a temple then. There was no question in her impassive voice, but Naruto nodded nonetheless, stopping for a moment to dredge up 6-year-old memories. It made him wonder how he had actually managed to remember things before his Rinnegan made his memory practically photographic. Yeah. If I remember right, then I think there should be one a few streets from the main market. The man there was always nice to me, he gave me food sometimes. At that a small smile finally wormed its way onto Fu's face. It was good to know that out of all the stories Naruto had told her of his pained childhood there had been a few decent people. Of course, the fact that a young boy would have to think so much of even the meager offering of food a monk could give him was equally depressing, making the smile immediately slip away. A few minutes later, and a lot of navigating through bustling market streets, and the trio were standing outside of a small, dilapidated temple. However, the building seemed deserted, the glass on the windows was choked with dust, and the door itself didn't seem to have been opened in years. As Naruto remembered it, the kindly man who had lived there, who he now understood to have been a monk, had always prided himself on how well he maintained his home and place of meditation. An elderly woman who was out sweeping her porch noticed Naruto staring at the building in confusion, sending him a kindly smile. "I don't know what you expected to find here, sonny, but the old monk that lived there is long gone." Naruto widened his eyes slightly, broken out of his confusion by the croaky voice. "Do you know where he went?" The woman peered at Naruto for a moment, and for a second, he feared she had recognized him. However, she simply appeared to be looking over his robes before her eyes lingered on the long monk staff in his hand. "Ah, you're a monk then? No, sorry, I have no idea where he went." The woman sighed, resting against her broom and wiping a few strands of her graying hair away from her eyes. "Shame too, very nice man, always helping everybody he could. One day he was here, doing what he usually did, then around 6 years ago he just up and left. Apparently, he got some kind of message from the head monk of the fire temple itself telling him to move out of Konoha." The woman shook her head before allowing a kindly smile to alight on her wrinkled features. "But I don't believe that personally. I mean, why would he ask him to do that?" Naruto just nodded idly, tipping his head in thanks. It turned out it was the same story at all of the temples they visited, or at least all of the ones Naruto could remember. It seems 6 years ago they had all just up and left. There were rumors of them returning to the fire temple, but at the time Naruto didn't really know anybody, so a few new arrivals would have gone completely unnoticed. The time was too specific to be a coincidence though. Their leaving seemed to coincide with around the time he had been taken into the fire temple. Finally, they had to settle for a small inn that was rather out of the way of the more busy areas of the village, close to the northern edge, near the wall. It was quiet and there were only a few patrons, with everybody else jostling for hotels and inns closer to the stadium so that they could get better seats on the day. However, it was ideal for Naruto and his companions. Fewer people just meant less chance of being spotted and recognized. Although he knew it was irrational due to how much he had changed over the years, he still felt like that little kid, just waiting to turn a corner and find those same looks he had grown up with. "That's the park. When I was really little the Hokage once took me there. Right in the middle there's this little hill that lets you see over the trees and gives you a really good view of the Hokage monument. He spent the whole afternoon just sitting with me, talking to me about all the great things the previous Hokage had done." Naruto had a tired smile as he walked past the central park of the village, pointing in the vague direction he remembered that hill to be. "I really wanted to believe him back then. I didn't understand why the villagers treated me so differently, so when he told me how these men were so greatly respected and loved, I vowed to become like them so that I could be acknowledged that way too." Naruto chuckled softly as he looked away from the happy memory, one of the precious few he had of that time. "Of course, now I understand that you aren't respected because you are in a position of power and authority, you get there because you are respected and loved by the people. It was pretty foolish of me, but I was just a kid back then, too naive to realize that I would have to change the hearts of the people if I ever wanted to earn their respect." Haku placed a comforting hand on his shoulder as they walked, for a few steps behind, silently absorbing everything he had been saying. It was a good dream. Perhaps if things had been different, you might have stayed and really changed how the people saw you. Naruto gave a small shrug, but his smile did widen slightly. Maybe, but who knows? I certainly wouldn't change anything about now though, otherwise I might never have had you too. He purposefully made sure Fu saw him look at her, making the mint-haired girl look down, a stain of red just peeking out from her caramel cheeks. Anyway, I want to show you guys this building that had a great view of this little roof garden I used to watch. At night fireflies would gather there. Haku nodded along as Naruto narrated yet another place in the village he had come to love in his childhood. They were always such little things like a particularly good view, or an alleyway where the smell of baked goods wafted through the air. He noticed that apart from a few, mostly involving the Hokage, Naruto didn't have any actual sentimental places. He also noted that Naruto never once mentioned where he lived to them, instead taking them to these small, but still heartwarming places that still managed to hold a small space in his heart. Haku blinked though as he realized Naruto was no longer next to him. Looking around in confusion he spotted the boy a few meters back, just staring at an empty space beside the street. Naruto? The blonde seemed unresponsive, but when Haku looked around he saw nothing special, just an empty space to the side of the street. It seemed a little strange there was no building or stall there, considering it was a rather busy area of the village, but other than that it was unremarkable. However, Naruto was staring at it as if he could see into the very depths of the pure world itself. Naruto? Fu seemed just as concerned for the young monk as she rested a hand on his shoulder. She nearly gasped though in shock when she noticed a single tear roll its way down the boy's cheek. Never in her time traveling with Naruto had she seen him cry over nothing like this. In fact, the only time she ever recalled seeing tears mar his features was after Shizuka's death. It was here. Naruto's voice was barely a whisper as more tears escaped his eyes to join the first, making small streams down his cheeks. I thought. He just trailed off as he took a step forward, walking out until he was at the center of the tiny plot of land. I thought I had let you rest, but I couldn't. He slowly fell to his knees, much to both Haku and Fu's shock, who had only ever seen Naruto as an immovable pillar of strength. His fingers grasped at the loose earth around him as a few tears dropped to the ground below him as if trying to expel high anguish. I'm sorry Tuchi I. His breath hitched as he felt a hand gently wrap around his shoulders. When he managed to look up he saw Fu staring down at him, a soft, compassionate smile on her face. It was the first show of genuine emotion he had seen from her the entire day, but it didn't dry his tears. A moment later he felt Haku's hand also rest on his other shoulder, and just about managed a grateful smile to the boy. Who were they? The blonde managed a choked laugh as his grip on the loose soil tightened, making his knuckles turn white. They. A soft smile drifted across his lips as he reached up a sleeve to wipe away his tears as best he could. They were family. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfictions. Looking forward to having you on board again.